Hey everybody, this video is going to go over the second essay that you were asked to read for the week 7 arguing cause exercise. So this essay was called Disparities Demystified. The first question asks you, what is the author's, what's their main claim? All right. If you thought that the main claim was the section that says, the consistent racial gap in student performance, while not new, reinforces well-established assumptions regarding the relationship between race, academic and ability, and intelligence, that's very close. That is definitely a general way of encapsulating what this essay is about, what their argument is about. They are focusing on the causes of the racial gap in student achievement. And they are saying that the link between race, academic ability, and intelligence, which is thought to be the cause of the gap in student achievement, is a very wide-held belief that that is the cause. That basically what that means is that racial gap in student achievement, people are looking at only certain causes, only certain factors that figure into the problem. And what they have come up with for many, many years now is that there is a link between a person's race and their academic ability and intelligence. Let me say that again. That a person's race determines their academic ability and intelligence. And that is why we see such a racial gap in student achievement. Okay. However, they get even more specific. The biggest causes that are always thrown out there into the media and in politics and in any kind of conversation that talks about this issue and how to solve it, the causes are dysfunctional families, lazy and unmotivated students, and the culture of poverty. That those three things are the causes of the racial gap in student achievement. Dysfunctional families, lazy and unmotivated students, and the culture of poverty. And these two authors are saying, no, that's not really the root cause of this gap in student achievement. It is the conditions under which children are educated and the quality of schools they attend are also a big part of the cause. Basically, it's inequality in education. That's the reason, the underlying cause for that gap in student achievement. It is not because there is a link between a person's race, their academic ability, and intelligence. And it is not, at least it's not solely because of dysfunctional families, lazy and unmotivated students, and the culture of poverty. So they do kind of come back to that a little bit. But basically their claim is that no, none of those are the real cause for why there is a racial gap in student achievement. The real cause is inequality of education, that students are not receiving equal educations. It would be really easy to assume that they're talking about the culture of poverty. And they do touch on that, but that's actually not where they end up going with that idea. So the next question is, how do they address other perspectives? And then to choose two passages where they directly take on other views. Well, they do point out that, living in poverty is definitely a hindrance on achievement, right? However, that's still not, to them, the biggest underlying cause. So they do kind of make a concession there, but that is a good point. There is, there's definitely something to be said for living in poverty. But then they offer the rebuttal, which is maybe that's not really even about race, though. Maybe, that's not, you're assuming that poor equals minority. And nowadays, that's not necessarily the case. So they move past that point really quickly. They talk about that consortium of schools trying to undo the racial gap. So pointing out that there's hope, but they also follow that up with a rebuttal that even those schools are pessimistic that it will work, because that consortium is trying to really dig into the causes of that gap in student achievement and really invested in trying to rectify it. And the hope is that then other schools around the country will do the same. That's great. But the authors aren't so optimistic, because even the people in those districts, the school leaders in those districts, are not overly optimistic either. Towards the end of the argument, after they've given what they believe to be the root cause of the gap in student achievement and their proposal for how we can overcome it, they admit that they would be costly, the changes that would need to be made. So they concede a point there, but then they come back with, but the changes that we're suggesting really aren't that radical. In fact, these measures already exist in many middle-class suburban schools. Now we just have to bring these same concepts to the urban schools. They don't really spend a whole, they do touch on the opposition, but the majority of their essay really hones in on their line of reasoning for the root cause of the achievement gap. The third question, how does their assertion, how does their claim relate to mainstream views? And I've kind of already touched on this. They start in the first paragraph with what the mainstream views are, that it's either that race determines academic ability and intelligence, or the gap is there because of dysfunctional families, lazy and unmotivated students, and the culture of poverty. But I think they really touch on mainstream views in that first whole half. They point out that the mainstream views aren't looking at other factors, that they're not examining closely enough other things that might be going into the achievement gap. I think in paragraph 6 they really get into it a little bit as well, when they're talking about that consortium and the mainstream views once we desegregated. The mainstream views of minority students, always seen as challenges, as problems. Their claim, how does it work into those mainstream views? Well, obviously they are arguing that there's more to it than that. I think that to answer question number 4, because it leads right into that, the most persuasive part for me of their argument is paragraphs, like the whole middle part, paragraphs like 6 to 13, I think, when they take us, they give us facts, and then there's an appeal to fairness, and then more facts with some authority because they quote some people, or at least refer to some studies, and then more statistics, and then there's appeal to identity, how we form our identities, that we value identity, and then there's an appeal to the need to be accepted, when they talk about students who want to be accepted by their peers, and so they don't take those AP classes, or they don't join into extracurricular activities that aren't sports related. And then there's an appeal to equality. I think that strategy, that strategy is so persuasive. It's like everything just flows from one idea to the next, and you really understand how they're getting us from the history paragraph 6, where they explain what happened after desegregation, and then taking us all the way through these other factors that all contribute to why there is that gap in achievement. The last question, question 5, asks us to look at paragraphs 3 through 6 and look at the line of reasoning, and how the logic builds from paragraph to paragraph. So in paragraph 3, they're talking about how the gap isn't just about race, because all races perform poorly in poor districts. So that's really more, it gets you thinking about more social inequality or class issues instead of just race issues. So you'd think that if you took, the next step of the logic is, so in more affluent districts where there's more money, right, where there's more wealth, minority children still perform lower than their white and Asian classmates. So then it's not just class, because if it was just about class and just about poverty, then taking those students, taking minority students and putting them in a richer school district, they would perform better at the same level as their white and Asian classmates. But they don't. They still don't. That could imply that the opposition is correct, then, that maybe there is just a link between race and academic ability and intelligence. And you say, no, studying the racial gap, the racial achievement gap in affluent schools should show a narrower, if not non-existent gap, but they do provide us a group to study. And we're still not looking at the history of desegregated educational practices. And these practices have always focused on the fact of integration, but not how to educate within integration. So minority students were seen as an intrusion. They were seen as a challenge from the very beginning, and they have continued to be seen that way even up until today in a lot of school districts around the country. So it could have been a class issue, but it's not. And it's not just about being in a poor school versus a rich school, because even in the rich schools, the minority students still aren't doing well. The line of reasoning there is very, it's very effective, because they almost concede a point to the opposition, but then they quickly flip it, and before you know it, they have just completely shot down the opposition, because they're like, okay, sure, it could be class, because students of all races seem to perform poorly in poorer districts. So let's take those minority students out of those poor districts, put them into a more affluent district, and they should flourish. Oh, but they don't. So why is that? Why is it that even in more affluent districts where money is not a problem, where educational opportunities are not a problem, why aren't these minority students doing better? And that last paragraph of that section, paragraph 6, that is where they start the emphasis of their argument, starting with how unprepared schools were for integration and how they never bothered to find out or figure out how to best teach these minority students who are now allowed to come to these schools. And it's a shame. I love the whole middle section of that essay, though, where they talk about the AP classes, that even in those more affluent, that a lot of students, minority students, are in schools where there might not even be any AP classes offered. However, even when they are in districts that offer a wide variety of AP courses, first of all, they are actively discouraged from taking them. They're told that they'd be too hard or whatever. I mean, that's a bunch of crap. But then, turns out, they may not even want to take them anyway, because so much of their identity, which is in large part formed by how people interact with you at school, because that's where you spend so much of your day, they're being told those classes are not for them. So they believe it, they internalize it. There's also the peer pressure, that maybe you are a minority student who actually would really like to take an AP class, but you're afraid of what your friends are going to think, so you don't. It's a very interesting walk through that line of reasoning, and I think they do it very well. I think it's a pretty persuasive essay. I think it's pretty effective. I feel like it's a conversation starter, though, and not, I don't know that they really give us hardcore supporting evidence to say, oh, you are absolutely 100% correct. That is the cause. I think what they do is they give us a lot of really convincing support that makes us say, wow, that's, it definitely sounds like you're on to something. This needs to be explored even further. And I hope that it is. I don't know how, I'd love to hear the dialogue of these essays too, if there were more, talking back and forth to each other. If you have any additional questions or comments about this essay, please let me know. I think it's a very cool essay to read. I think they hit on a lot of really interesting ideas, and I have a feeling that it may have resonated with you guys as well, your students. Some of you not coming out of high school that long ago. So it's interesting I'd be interested to hear your take on their arguments. So if you feel like it, you can shoot me an email. Otherwise, you guys are free to move on to the last video.